All right, I think we are ready to go here. So we're going to start the panel. People will trickle in over the next few minutes. But I'm going to introduce briefly here our moderator, Mr. James Swanson, who is a partner with Miller Thomson, maintains offices in Edmonton and Calgary, regularly practices in the areas of innovation, digital technologies, and maintains numerous clients in those areas. He's going to tell you a bit more about himself, introduce the rest of our panelists, and the theme for this panel is legal technologies and innovations. So we're going to hear from people who are actually disrupting the practice of law itself, innovators and some of the brightest minds in legal technology. So without further ado, James, take it away.
Well, thank you, Alec, and good morning, everyone. What you really need to know about me is I was born and grew up on a farm in southern Alberta in extreme poverty with no electricity until I was 6. So now I'm playing catch-up. The other thing I did before I went to law school and during law school is I played keyboards in a number of rock and blues bands. So this is kind of familiar territory. I just feel like I need to do that. I'll start off with one of my favorite jokes. It's always good as a moderator to offend 90% of the people in the room, so that's what I'm going to do. Why do lawyers go to law school? To escape math, science, accounting, and software. That used to work. Doesn't anymore. So with me, we have a really great group of panelists today, and I'm just going to introduce them in the order they're sitting next to me. Immediately to my I guess the stage left, your right. Reminds me of Snagglepuss, right? Exit stage left. Is Derek Hopfner, who's a co-founder of Founded Technologies, which when I looked at the website, I thought, wow, I can't wait till they launch in Alberta. And now I find that may or may not be delayed, but Derek will tell you more about that. Next to Derek is Jason Morris, who's the founder of Roundtable Law based in Sherwood Park, but it's basically a virtual firm as I understand. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. I did practice to some extent virtually back in the 90s when I had my own internet law firm. And the third panelist is Jimo Oviagala, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Ross Intelligence, commonly referred to by people who may not fully understand how it works as a robot lawyer. And I like the comment earlier about robots. They're not really robots. They're more algorithms. But that's all I'm going to say about the three gentlemen on the panel. Then I'm just going to go in the same order, introduce them, and each of them gets about 10 minutes, and I'm not nearly as good a timekeeper as the previous moderator, so it may be a little more chaotic. So Derek, take it away.
So I took the same approach as Kate took to the presentation and made sure I had a slide on Ross. So that's about 4 or 5 in. So my name's Derek. I'm one of the founders of a company called Founded. I graduated law here in 2009. I practiced law at Emory Jameson for about 7 years, and then I left and started building legal technology about 2015 in our offices in Toronto. So today I'm not going to talk at all about what we do at Founded, really. I'm more interested in talking just the idea of law changing. And we talked about it a little bit, or the panelists talked a little bit on the first session, which is the idea of law moving from an artisanal practice to something more mass market, and what a factory law might look like. I don't have a clicker or no. That's down arrow.
Space bar.
None of it's working.
This is notionally a technology law conference.
Oh, there we go. Great. Okay, so let's start off. This here, everyone's idea of the traditional lawyer, perhaps. But what I wanted to talk about this is everyone's idea of law is a very much one-to-one approach. So a lawyer gets a legal problem. It's this new thing they haven't seen before. They have to leave every stone unturned. Very much an artisanal practice. And the one thing you can see here is it is in fact the true historical lawyer, because that is the picture used in Wikipedia. Okay, so that's what law firms used to do, is they used to provide everything on the supply chain. They used to provide all legal services. So whether that is the actual advice at the end of the tunnel, or it's the photocopying, it's the document generation, it's the document review, as the student was saying before. And what we're seeing, I think now, is due to the pace of business changing, legal services are changing. So we look here Number of years it took to reach 50 million users. On the top left, we have airplanes, which took 68 million. And then on the bottom right, we have Pokemon Go, which took 19 days. But this means something, and it means something to the practice of law because it's changing the way that we deliver legal services. So what does that change look like for us here and when we're thinking about law? Well, that's where I think the idea of law as a factory comes in, and how when we're looking, at least in the short term, what law firms and how they practice might be changing. So what I want to do is take a look at law as a factory, both in terms of a legal market standpoint, briefly, and then also from an individual legal task, and how you can approach that either way. So here we have, very generally speaking, just some general legal work. Okay, everything from general run the company work all the way to bet the company work. And what I mean by this, you can kind of see on the top. So run the company work traditionally was done by either law firms or in-house counsel. Okay, in-house counsel would take something on the far left where it would be business operations, and then you would have the commoditized matters. So maybe you can think of things like foreclosure work, things that you're going to be doing over and over again, and then even moving into the strategic matters. Again, is something that can be considered run the company work. And then Kate was indicating, that 12 minutes of advice that you give to the board to save the company, that's what we're looking at in the bet the company work on the far right. Again, a law firm is the one traditionally that would have been providing all of this work, other than perhaps in-house counsel on the far left. And it's changing. And here's the raw slide. So that's good. So now what we have is a lot of different things, especially attacking the run the company work. And with that, we have legal service providers like Axiom, and then we also have technologies that are being used to make that more efficient. And what's happening now is that work, unless law firms catch up and are able to make use of technology like some firms are, is going to other service providers in the supply chain. I think it's fair to say that large law and big law have a good handle on the bet the company work, and I don't think actually that's at risk for a long time for big law. Now, if we take a similar granular approach with an actual legal task. Now, this is a really simple one. I'm not going to go into something like an M&A because that would be a lot more steps to it, but just incorporating a company. Again, this is something that one lawyer used to do every step along the way. Acquire the client, figure out what information they need in order to be able to properly incorporate the company, provide some advice perhaps on share structure and working with your accountant, file documents with the government, prepare the necessary company formation documents, and then deliver those final documents to the client. And then again, viewing it in many tasks, what you can do is figure out the appropriate service provider for each task. So as a lawyer, one of the questions initially was, how do we make more money? Well, before the lawyer maybe used to spend 2 hours in order to get all these things done. Now they can spend 5 minutes providing the advice and have other professionals and technologies used in order to do more of these at a more efficient pace. And the reason why this is exciting is because we're only really capturing right now 10 or 15% of the legal market. There's still 80, 85, 90% of legal consumers that aren't being serviced by traditional law. So you can view this two ways. You can view it as eating, lawyer's pie, or you can see the actual pie itself being expanding considerably. The reason why I put Founded on there is that's what our company does. Is we are essentially a digital legal platform that both entrepreneurs and lawyers can use to create documents, to save documents, and have a shared source of truth as the company grows and perhaps has ESOPs and things like that that can be automated. A nice way to think of it is kind of like QuickBooks, but for the legal industry. This is a little small, but I've been interested in the idea of law as a factory for a while. I was at a conference about 1.5 years ago in Toronto, and one of the executives from Axiom, which I'll talk about in a little bit, was speaking on this very idea of law as a factory. And then, so I tweeted about it, and then right away I got a common complaint when you think about law as a factory, which is a lot of those factories are churning out Ford Pintos. And I was initially really excited. If people don't know who Ken Adams is, he's actually a fantastic mind in contract drafting. So when my phone went off and I saw that minor legal celebrity perhaps was tweeting, I got excited and then realized that he wasn't liking what I had to say. We eventually realized and came to an agreement actually that the issue here isn't the fact that using like the idea of law factory is going to produce bad results. It's if you put crap into the factory, it's going to produce bad contracts, bad algorithms, and all the rest. So it's important to develop the factory well. And that's what we end up with the law factories: faster, cheaper, and better. And there's a few things that I'll highlight here, but the first thing that you get when you break apart a legal problem into minor tasks is you get standardization. And with standardization, you get a better product over time because you work on making the initial product great, and then you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You get standardization also in terms of your ability to market and brand your firm, your legal product, and things like that. It decreases the costs involved, and again, obviously it makes things much faster. So some factory models that are in existence right now that are doing really well. So Axiom I've talked about a little bit already. So what is Axiom? It's a legal services staffing firm, I guess is like a very high level way to think about it. It does exist in Canada now. It recently purchased Cognition Law about a year and a half ago, and it services mostly the top companies in Canada with the commoditized type of work. So they're big already. They have about 2,000 legal professionals and are hitting revenues of over $300 million a year. And what they're doing is that run the company work better than law firms used to. And on the right, we have accounting firms. And we're talking about, the Legal Professions Act and things changing in the first session. Well, accounting firms are already providing legal services. Collectively, this group of 4 accounting firms has 8,500 lawyers working with them around the world. And PwC, in terms of just sheer numbers, has 2,500 legal professionals, which is the 6th largest law firm in the world. So if we don't change in our idea of the way a law firm can operate, can be held from an equity standpoint and things like that, we're going to get blown by from these other service providers. And one of the things that's in common with all of them is none of them are law firms. So what I'm going to end with is just, because I think there are some young lawyers here or law students, is what to think about a little bit if you're a young lawyer. From a high level, I think it's just really exciting and opportunity to go into law and to be thinking about these issues. By knowing the legal market, I think more generally, and to be able to break apart legal tasks will make you a better lawyer and be able to position yourself when looking at work, at whether it's a firm or in-house position or something very much outside of that. But the other thing is the way that you approach law generally. So Seth Godin is an internet entrepreneur. He did a great podcast, which I'd recommend everyone to listen to, with a group called Building New Law. They're out of Toronto. It's associated with a law firm, but Seth Godin did an interview with them. And one of the things he mentioned that really resonated with me and I think is good for young lawyers to hear is imagine your job is to put the left wheel on a car at a factory. And all you do is you put bolts on the tire, and then that tire gets put onto the actual car. Now, if cars in the future don't have tires, well, what happens? Well, you can view yourself one of 2 ways. If you are the bolt screwer, then you're out of a job. But if you fundamentally believe yourself to be a car maker, well, then you still have a position and you're fine to go. And I think as we see law changing, the actual tasks that lawyers will be doing will change over time, but the legal education we're getting at the Faculty of Law and things like that will be while positioning us so that we can take advantage of the technologies that are changing, the procedures that are changing, so that we can continue to practice law. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Derek. Next up is Jason Morris from Roundtable Law.
Thank you very much. So I do run a virtual paperless cloud-based law firm out of my home in Sherwood Park. Currently 2 partners, hoping to increase that number. Have an articling student from the U of A joining us at the end of their 3rd year in a few months here, so looking forward to that. I do a lot of workflow automation like Kate was talking about. I use a lot of cloud-based systems to kind of tie all my software together and make it do things when I'm not there. If you'd like to ask me questions about any of that, I'm happy to talk with you during the question and answer or afterwards, and at the end my details are on the slide. So that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about today was, because the topic is innovative legal services, this is a thing that I'm working on as a part of my LLM through the U of A Faculty of Law and the Department of Computing Science. And the idea here is regression testing laws or contracts. So regression testing is a thing that happens in software development. Just to humor me, put up your hand if you have any idea what regression testing is before you saw this slide. And of the people who have your hand up, how many of you are programmers, amateur, or all of you? Okay. Regression testing is basically this idea where you may have seen some funny update notices on your iPhone apps where the developer says that we've fixed these bugs and we've added 7 more that we don't know about. Every time you change software, you cause problems. And one of the tools that software developers use to avoid those kinds of problems is regression testing. And essentially the idea is when they can think of a problem that might happen or they experience a problem that already has happened, they develop a tool that they can run automatically, which will, the next time they change the software, they'll run that tool against the software and be able to determine whether or not that problem has arisen or that problem has reoccurred, that they've brought some former problem back into the software. So regression testing is kind of like just making sure your software isn't regressing when you change it. So the idea is, can we do that with laws? So you can, and this was the experiment that I was doing as a part of my LLM. What you have to do is you have to take the law or contracts. This works probably better in contracts than it does for statute law, but my experiment was in law. So you have to take the statute and the relevant common law and you have to encode them in a programming language that's designed for that purpose. And then you have to take your bug, whatever the legal outcome that you weren't expecting was, and encode that into the programming language as well. Then you need to have the software automatically generate a bunch of random fact scenarios, and then have the software determine what the legal outcomes are for all of those fact scenarios, and then have it search those outcomes for the problem that you're trying to avoid and see if it arose. So what you need is a tool that will allow you to kind of make these parallels between statute law and computer code real by turning the statute law into actual computer code. And the tool that I used in my experiment for doing that is something called Ergo Suite, which is offered by a company called Coherent Knowledge. I'm not going to pretend that this is user-friendly software. This is, you're a programmer if you're using this stuff. But it does exist, and academic licenses are available, and the people there have been very helpful in terms of helping me solve the problems about how I was using it. So if this is something you think you might be interested in, get in touch. Now, the actual experiment that I decided was, if you've taken IP law, you may be familiar with Euro Excellence and Craft. I won't go into the details, but what I decided to do was to take the kind of odd outcome in that case and imagine that that was an unintended and unanticipated consequence of how the Copyright Act had been written. So that's the bug, right? So the idea was, can I encode the Copyright Act and the relevant common law, and then encode the outcome as a bug, the thing that we would like to avoid that happened in Euro Excellence and Craft, and then use regression testing to figure out whether the software would be able to discover that problem exists and potentially discover any other similar types of problems exist. So this is just to give you an idea of what it looks like. This is the Ergo code encoding a portion of the, well, what is this exactly? This is actually encoding a portion of the common law that came out of the decision. This is encoding one of the paragraphs in which the Supreme Court Justice says that, generally speaking, a person without a property right can't sue someone who has a property right for a property infringement. So that's what this says, except in Ergo. This is what the actual bug was encoded as. You can see the green text, and I'm happy to provide copies of the actual code or whatever you might be interested in. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of what visually these kinds of legal engineering tasks actually look like. This was the code that was required in order to generate test scenarios, and I was very grateful to have a friend who has a PhD in mathematics from the U of A, so that I could talk to him about how to simplify the software so that it wasn't testing 400,000 redundant scenarios, and it actually was only testing the various scenarios that would be legally different from each other. And then this is the software that actually took each one of those scenarios, created sale, product, work, assignment, license objects for all of them, tested to see whether or not any bugs came out, and then deleted that stuff and moved on to the next one. So the results were that the software found 140 possible combinations of owner, seller, manufacturer, place of manufacturer, assigner, and assignee. All of those are people, except for the place of manufacturer, which was either Canada or not Canada. And it took 30 seconds to chew through all 140 scenarios, find out what was going on and whether there was a bug. And it found the situation in craft and marked that as a bug, and it also found two other situations that had never been litigated, as far as I'm aware. At least I was not aware of any litigation of them. One where the infringing product and the sale is done by the copyright owner in Canada, and another one described there under number 3. The point being that the experiment demonstrated that if you can define the code, the law, and you can define an undesirable outcome, it's possible to have a computer run through any number of possible legal fact scenarios and find fact scenarios that would result in outcomes that you weren't looking for, right? So if you imagine this is a service that you could offer to a bank. You could say this bank has a form that they have all of their clients sign when they are making changes to the signing authorities on the account. And they want to change this form for some reason. If that form is encoded this way, and the other forms that they have used in the past are encoded this way, you as the law firm could write the new version that they want, but then you could also write the coded version of what they want, and you could have your software spend a week churning through 3 million randomly generated fact scenarios to test against the 500 bad things that you've encoded for, and you would be able to say to your client, with no additional manpower effort, except for encoding it, we have checked this against 3 million possible scenarios, and in those scenarios, as far as we're able to tell, none of these bad things will happen, so you're probably good to go. That is a service that lawyers provide right now. Someone before was saying that part of our job is to imagine bad things that could happen. We can essentially use computers to imagine more things and figure out if they're bad, which is I think, fascinating opportunity. It's not something that I see being offered anywhere, and so I thought that would be a really interesting thing to kind of share with you. Is this is something that's maybe coming soon to a legal market near you. The good news is that it's possible. It's easier now than it used to be because the programming languages are designed for legal purposes and they're becoming more sophisticated. Also because the technology, the hardware is getting faster and more powerful, chewing through a lot of different scenarios, particularly in these logic programming languages, requires a lot of processing power, but that's getting cheaper. The bad news is, as of right now, that's not particularly pretty. That's programming, and I mean, you have to as of right now, you have to feel like a programmer when you're dealing with that. But then again, so did anyone who was using computers for accounting before spreadsheets were invented. And so I'm kind of hoping that at some point someone will invent the spreadsheet equivalent for these kinds of programming languages. But it's not there yet. The more complex the scenario you're trying to model, exponentially more time and processing power is required. And you still have certain problems that you can't get around, like ambiguity or incoherence in the law, that make it very difficult to model. There's a couple of things that I will say that people imagine are problems that aren't. One of the things is what do you do with those sections of the law where the decision is subjective, and how do you encode that? And the answer is you can do that in these tools. You just treat it as a variable instead of treating it as an outcome. So essentially, if there was some subjective value, like in the copyright thing of is it a good product, and the judge was just deciding that based on how they felt and what they had for breakfast that dinner or that morning, then you would add that as a variable and say one of the variables is, did the judge think it was a good product? And then the advice that you give your client is, if they think it's a good product, this will work, and if they think it's a bad product, then it won't. So you can deal with those kinds of subjective things. There's also some indeterminacy in terms of sometimes the ambiguity can be turned into more than one version of the software. You can have it run based on two different interpretations of the same section of the law. If you have different interpretations coming from different courts or it's not clear, all of that can be built in, and you just run it multiple times against all the different versions of the law that you can encode. So there you go. That's a potential future product, regression testing for contracts and legislation.
So there's a business opportunity for someone in the room if you're taking notes. And I thought all I had to worry about was learning how to code smart contracts on Ethereum. Maybe more work to do. Next up is Gmo. It's going to take about 10 minutes to talk about Ross or whatever else he wants to talk about.
Hi, my name is Gmo Viagle. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Ross Intelligence. My background isn't law. I studied computer science at the University of Toronto. I previously worked developing software for self-driving cars and natural language processing systems, and I co-founded Ross Intelligence in my third year of university. So today I want to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, artificial intelligence and deep learning. But first I want to apologize because I didn't bring Ross here with me today. That's because artificial intelligence, it's not about robo-lawyers, it's not about robots. You hear a lot of talk in the media today about these computers waking up and coming to take our jobs. And what I'm here to tell everyone today is I haven't seen anything that would suggest that sentient robots are on the horizon. Technology today is sort of like how transportation was in the late 1800s. Before, people got around with horse and carriage. And then Carl Benz came around and he invented the automobile. Carl Benz is the founder of Mercedes-Benz. But people didn't go and call it a teleportation machine. They simply thought of it as a faster way to get from point A to point B. And that is what artificial intelligence is today. So what are these deep neural networks that you may have heard about in the news? What deep neural networks are is that they're a computer model designed to mimic how the human brain learns. Why this is special is because this gives computers the ability to learn how to do tasks that we couldn't program them to do. And these are already making tremendous, or having a tremendous impact across several industries. They're already in our favorite products, like our smartphones and our smart speakers. which I know many of you probably gifted to someone over the holidays or received as a gift yourselves. It's deep learning that is the reason why these systems could suddenly understand what you're saying. And while these are cool, what I'm really excited about is the impact that they're having in professions like medicine, like farming, and what we are doing at Ross Intelligence, bringing it to the legal industry. So today, doctors are already working hand in hand with neural networks to help diagnose patients more accurately than ever before. We often trust doctors to do this by themselves, but the truth of the matter is that it's very error prone, and some of these images are very hard for the human eye to read. So in medicine, deep neural networks have a huge potential to save millions and millions of lives every single year. It's having a big impact on farming now too. One of the last places that I think people would guess. Plant diseases destroy acres and acres of crops a year. And what this does, it puts farms out of business, which hurts our economy. It raises food prices, which makes it hard to live in these already economically tough times. And in some places in the world, this can even result in food shortages and starvation. So here is an area where deep learning with farmers can help save the day. And what we are doing at Ross Intelligence is we're using and teaching deep neural networks to read cases and help lawyers do legal research. My co-founder, Andrew, used to always complain to me how he would spend hours searching and combing through cases. So that's why we decided to build technology to do this for lawyers, to read through millions of cases, gather the sections that answer the question so that lawyers can conduct their research in a faster and better way. And many people, when they hear this, they're afraid that, oh, this is going to come and take lawyers' jobs, but that's not the case. Because what this really is a faster way to get from point A to point B. And this is what we're doing for customers all across the US currently, from solo practitioners to large law firms like Latham and Watkins. And the reason why they came to us is a fact that I think has came up many times today in this conference, is that clients expect better, faster, and more affordable service. And you can't do that by adding more lawyers or hours to the equation. What you have to do, you have to make the lawyers you have to make yourselves superhuman. And that's what we're devoted to. We're devoted to building AI technology that gives lawyers superpowers. So that's all I have for my introduction today, and I'm super honored to be here on behalf of Ross Intelligence.
Thank you, Jimo. One observation I've heard many times that kind of fits in with that is 9 women cannot make a baby in 1 month. So putting more people on the job doesn't necessarily get better results. It doesn't work. So I have a number of questions that were provided to me, and I'm not going to ask all of them. Some of them actually no longer make sense given what I've just heard. But I guess fundamentally, what's going to drive innovation in the legal profession? And one of the things that's always occurred to me is the standard law firm model takes all the money made that year and pays whatever the current bills are and gives all the rest to the partners. So there's no money left for research and development. And that's going to have to change, I would think. But having that in mind, what's going to drive innovation in the legal space to get firms to do R&D or to start thinking about these things more? What are the drivers for that? Maybe I'll just go in the same order again.
I think just given the underlying business structures in law for law firms, at least traditionally, the change has come as a result of clients asking for it, as a result of the financial crisis, and then businesses and large businesses trying to find ways to save money that in fact changed the way a lot of, I think, U.S. law firms approached providing legal services, and then also allowed a lot of new entrants to come in and deliver legal services in a new way. So I don't think we're at a stage yet where it's lawyers that are pushing change. I think it's still client-driven, and then lawyers find the right solution to match that need with the clients.
One thing that I think is probably not yet a major factor, but I see it coming, is there's a lot of talk currently with the new administration in the United States about the effect that free trade has had on where jobs have moved out of the United States to places that have an advantage in terms of labor costs. That mobility of work from one place to another exists for legal services too. And the thing that I see on the horizon is that when people start to expect legal services to be provided online predominantly, when the interview for the advice, when people are just as happy to have a Google Hangout as to go to an expensive downtown law office, when that happens, lawyers here will have a strategic disadvantage against lawyers in places like India and China and wherever, where they have all of the education, all of the technology that they need in order to be able to provide those services, and none of the restrictions that are placed on us by the regulators in Canada, and no means to enforce any of those sorts of restrictions. So to a certain degree, there's a risk that the regulation that we have that kind of restricts law firms is disadvantageous to the public in the sense that it prevents us from innovating. But there's another sense in which, no, it doesn't prevent everyone from innovating, it just prevents us from innovating. And so eventually we're going to have to start playing catch up. I think that's going to be one of the drivers.
Yeah, from our seat at Ross Intelligence, where we're seeing the demand for the innovation is from the top and from the bottom. From the bottom, when it comes to law school graduates entering the workforce, they're the iPhone generation, and they feel like they're going to law firms and getting handed BlackBerries. So there's a big push from there. And then it's also coming from the top, which are the clients. The clients really dictate everything. You're seeing more and more on RFPs becoming something that's increasingly popular when choosing law firms, going from, hey, let's get bids for who's going to do our work, rather than the relationship model that came before it. And on those RFPs, we're seeing requirements for technology, and they're starting to name specific technologies. So we recently signed on a big bank, and what they did, they started going to their outside counsel, and they're like, hey, are you using Ross? And if the answer, and it's going to be like that for many technologies, and if the answer is no, then it makes them question. It's like, are you doing everything in your power to make sure that we are getting the outcomes that we need, saving us money? So it's coming from the top as well, and I think the very, very top, really, at least in the U.S., and maybe different here in Canada, is really the financial industry. The financial industry is really the bread and butter for a lot of law firms in the U.S., and you could count on the financial industry to make more money and save as much money as they can. So when we started doing our investigations, when we sell into law firms, often they ask us about security. What security does Ross have? And we're like, okay, send us over your list. And they send us over their list of security requirements, and we are like, wow, this is a really long list of outdated protocols. Why do you still have this? And they don't want to hear it. They just want to hear that we met those requirements. But then when we push and push and push, we're like, yep, a few years ago, some bank said do this, and that's why we do this. So that's where we see those are where we see the levers right now. But there's also in between people who have been in law who want the work to feel better. They want to change their experience, and I think that is also very powerful.
Thank you. Many years ago, well, not that many years ago, I won an RFP with a medical software company, and later on they told me why I won it. I had the shortest response. One of the larger firms, it was here in Edmonton, they didn't even read it. It was too long. So, word to the wise. Banks are driving some of this innovation. It's very common, for example, for banks to ask you a lot of questions about your cybersecurity, which is where those protocols are coming from. And having read some of them, yeah, some of them are out of date. But at least it's driving law firms who are traditionally the low-hanging fruit to any hacker looking for something to penetrate to drive themselves to greater security. So let's talk about what specific areas of legal practice have the biggest potential to be disrupted. Any thoughts on that? And let's go back to GMO and work back this way. Any particular areas you're seeing that have the greatest potential to be disrupted by technologies like ROS?
Yeah, I think in terms of activities, they're the obvious ones. Computers already revolutionized discovery, but I think what we know as e-discovery tools today, that's simple technology to people in the technology industry. So I think that we're going to see further innovation on that front. Things like contract review, which can often be a repetitive task, can also be aided by machine learning systems. Document assembly, when you essentially have a template and you're just plugging in party names and different definitions. That is an obvious area. So I think those things really come to mind. And when we talk about that and when we hear people talking about that, those are the things that I think people are excited to be disrupted because that's not the fun part of the job from what I hear, but I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer.
Trust me, it's not the fun part of the job. When I talk about e-discovery occasionally, just as an aside, I have one slide that says, which do you have, a networked nightmare or a one-click affidavit of records? Nobody has a one-click affidavit of records yet, but I think that's the holy grail, and someday we'll get there. Jason, what are your thoughts on areas of law that are primed to be disrupted?
So, I don't know if it's areas of law in the sense of like practice areas that are really that I would think about as particular targets. I would say it's anything that maybe two categories. One, anything that lawyers are doing right now that is essentially just a data collection, some sort of data processing that is on a relatively well understood process, and then some sort of data return to the client. That's a very large category that covers a lot of what lawyers do. Obviously, it doesn't cover things like oral advocacy in front of a judge, but it covers a lot of other things. Anything that falls into that category, there are opportunities to do that way faster and more efficiently. And anyone who can get more efficient and who can make their business model one that takes advantage of the efficiency. If you can get those two things at the same time, then you're going to be able to disrupt the other people there. The other thing that I think is really ripe is the latent market. I think that with some of the technologies that are available right now, you could come up with legal services that were provided to people right now for things that people do not use lawyers for. And you could charge a very small amount for a very high volume of work. And you could probably disrupt the market in the sense that you could take over a very large share of the legal services that people are paying for, and at the same time take nothing away from any of the firms that are currently working. I think there's so much out there that the technology could do that lawyers don't, because there's no way to do it with lawyers efficiently enough to get the price down that people will pay for it. But I think there's a lot of stuff that you could do in the latent market.
Thank you. Derek?
Just, I agree both with Gmo and Jason, so I'm not going to repeat. I think there's a lot of opportunity, like they said, with making actual legal practices more efficient. But even thinking a little bit more globally, are there pieces of technology that will fundamentally change certain areas? So I think a good one that isn't brought up that often is dispute resolution and online dispute resolution, and very much for retail settings. So something like eBay. eBay would deal with absolutely millions of disputes that would otherwise not be able to be dealt with by two humans, with a legal professional being the intermediary. So thinking about that, are there other pieces of technologies or entire industries that are at risk of bypassing law altogether, or legal professionals altogether? And the other one that I'm sure we'll get into more in a bit is how is blockchain going to affect law? And I think that can tie into the effect that online dispute resolution has had to certain areas.
You just pressed the magic button and hit one of my current obsessions, which is the ability of blockchain-based platforms running smart contracts to automate transactions, to have digital identities permanently authenticated on a blockchain where they can't be changed. So I kind of see business and society in general moving to more of an automated platform, but most lawyers I know look at me really funny when I start talking about this stuff. But let's talk about that a bit. What changes are firms going to be forced to make if we start seeing a blockchain and smart contract future, for example, or any of the other technologies we're talking about, like AI and deep learning and so on? So I'll start with Derek. Do you see any changes in the near horizon? Because frankly, if it's more than 5 years out, I think you're smoking something that's about to be legal if you think you know what's going to happen after that.
Right.
So Derek, what do you think?
Yeah, two things on that. I think I'll just reference the presentation that I gave. I think the way law firms will change is really trying to figure out how they position themselves in that spectrum of legal services, and are they the type of firm that only does bet the company litigation? And if that's the case, then they'll specialize that and price accordingly, and it might not look like a billable hour model. Or are you looking to be really great at utilizing technology and doing some more of the commoditized work? I think we're going to start moving away from, and we already have, one law firm being the legal service provider for both the commoditizable work as well as the bet the company litigation. I think blockchain, I think it's well past 5 years out. I think it's really exciting. There's some really low-hanging fruit with blockchain and issuing shares, for example, that can solve identity and authentication issues, but there's a whole other suite of issues that I don't think are properly discussed when we think about blockchain, because it makes things faster and cheaper, but it makes things more restrictive because the way a contract is set out on the blockchain cannot be manipulated, or outcomes cannot be always identified. So sometimes you have to let certain things happen and then deal with kind of reverse litigation where going back in time and trying to correct what should have happened. So, yeah.
Well, to paraphrase Good Morning Vietnam, I do love the smell of litigation in the morning. Jason, you already have made significant changes to the way you practice. So what do you see as the changes law firms are going to have to make?
It's kind of hard to talk about the changes that law firms are going to have to make as a result of the technologies that are coming out now. It's easier to talk about the changes that law firms need to make as a result of the technologies that came out 20 years ago, because we still don't use them. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that I think we're going to have to I think we're going to have to adopt from, well, as an example, I have a 9-year-old, and 2 nights ago, we have a no screens policy on Wednesdays. And we made an exception to the no screens policy, which is you can use a computer screen on Wednesdays if what you're doing is computer programming. And so my 9-year-old pulled out a tablet and started playing with something called Scratch, which is a, you're nodding, yeah, right? So cool. If you haven't seen Scratch, you need to pull out Scratch and just look at one or two of the demonstration things at it. It's a Michigan Institute of Technology project that was designed to teach programming to kids, and forget that. It turned programming into a video game. It is amazing. And my 9-year-old is absolutely loving it, and he's using if-then statements and while loops, and he has no idea that he's doing any of these things. And I think that what Kate was saying earlier about curiosity, and specifically curiosity about technology, I think we need to just ingrain that in ourselves and recognize that we are at a bit of a problem point in time right now where we have this idea that we can give people a kind of a general education about how to survive in the world over the course of like 12 years. And then we can give people an education about how to survive in a particular career over the course of between 4 and 8 years. When the technologies now are going to change 3 times during the 8 years that you're in school. So I think that the biggest thing that law firms and more importantly individual lawyers are going to have to do is realize that there is no such thing as stopping your technological education. You have to be exceedingly curious, or you are going to be left behind by people who are only 10 or 15 years younger than you because they started learning this stuff in grade 3.
Jimo, do you have a take on the changes you expect law firms to make in response to what's emerging in technology?
There's what I think, and then there's what I hope will happen.
Let's do both.
I'll start with what I hope will happen. So according to The Social Network, the movie, it took Mark Zuckerberg 3 months to build the first version of the Facebook. And today that would take me just 1 night. And that's not because I'm smarter or I'm a better programmer. That's because technology has developed and have made me as an engineer that much more productive. So today, you're seeing thousands of startups getting created every year that are serving many other millions of people and companies. It's created a lot of economic value. That is what I hope to see in the legal industry. I hope to see small teams, solo practitioners doing more than they could have done 5, 10, 15 years ago. And this ties into what Jason said earlier, in that there's a latent market of legal consumers. 80% of people in the United States who need legal services can't afford it. And this market, it's not like they don't have any money. They don't have any money at the price point that we're currently offering legal services at. These people don't engage with the law the same way that some people do. A concrete example is I recently hired an engineer a few weeks ago. And when I gave him his employment contract, he said, let me have a few days and I'm going to have an employment lawyer review it. And then this struck me. And it wasn't because I was offended or anything. I think that's a great thing to do, but it just wasn't something that I would have done because I never had the money to afford to get an employment lawyer. Employment law is something that should protect everyone, not just people who have the money to get it. This is what I hope law will do. This is what I hope lawyers will do with technology.
And I'd like to add, too, we talked a lot about the competitive pressures that are going to force law firms to make adjustments here. And I'm gonna put it out there that the big firms don't need to be worried about each other. They need to be worried about me, because I'm a solo practitioner. I knew how to program before I learned the law, and there is no adoption curve at my firm. If there's a technology that can be used that would make me more efficient, it's used tomorrow. And that's where the competitive pressures that the big firms are going to have trouble competing with is we're not using things that are secret. We're just using them faster.
And some of them aren't 20 years old, I bet.
Yeah, that's true.
So short story, back in the 90s, I had my own internet boutique. I actually was here in Edmonton. I practiced here until 2003. And I had a file where I had a software company as a client, and they got into this deal with a couple of brothers who were going to open a U.S. operation with them. And they hired a lawyer basically across the other side of Jasper Avenue from my little office, who I phoned him up and said, this was just when Word and Word Perfect were fighting it out. And I said, I can send you a copy of our proposed agreement. Do you want Word or do you want Word Perfect? I'll email it over to you. There's a pause, and then he said, and if you put the word "the" in front of email, you know you're in trouble. Anyway, he said, I don't exactly have the email. Do you have a fax? But anyway, we ended up, I talked him into me couriering discs over, because what he wanted to do was I'd fax him the agreement, he'd handwrite on it, fax it back to me, and then I would type it. I wasn't prepared to be his assistant. Anyway, the punchline is, when the deal was done, the two brothers phoned me up and said, we have other businesses now that this one's signed. Do you think there'd be a conflict if we hired you? Because we really don't like that guy. That's our dad's lawyer. So I'm a little older now, but I still don't fit my demographic. So let's talk a bit about the traditional lawyer. There's a joke about the factory of the future, but let's turn it into the law firm of the future. In the future, at some point, there will be a very small room with a frozen nitrogen cooled quantum computer running, and it will have two employees in the law firm. One will be the lawyer and one will be a dog. The lawyer's job will be to feed the dog, and the dog's job will be to bite the lawyer if he tries to touch anything. So if we talk about the traditional lawyer that we have today, is the traditional lawyer going anywhere? Is he or she just circling the bowl on the way down, or do they have a future? So let's start with Derek.
Sure. Just to go off of technology for a tiny bit, I read a great piece in Precedent magazine about 2 months ago, and it talked about this senior family law practitioner that had moved from his original law firm. And then he still wanted to practice, and he realized that he couldn't charge the types of clients that he was going to be getting, $600, $700 an hour. So what he decided to do was kind of break apart his practice, and now he ends up being more or less a litigation coach. So you're still getting the same advice and expertise from this lawyer, but he's realized that the clients that he's servicing can't pay for a 3-week trial and can't pay for his services over 6 months or a year. So he's taken not necessarily a technology point of this, but he's saying I can still provide real value to this underserved market where they're willing to pay me $3,000 to $5,000 for this coaching session to help them on their way. They're not willing to pay me $50,000 to $100,000. So I think a real way that the traditional lawyer will change is recognizing that the way we have practiced law over the last 150 years or longer, because it hasn't changed, will change. And then getting the necessary tools and new business approach to serving clients in order to expand the pie.
I'm skeptical about, it depends what you mean by traditional lawyer. I think about my grandparents' generation and the technological world that they lived in, and the technological world that my kids live in, and the kinds of experiences that my kids have that were impossible for my grandparents to even imagine. I don't think traditional law exists. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that anybody today is doing what lawyers did 150 years ago. I think we are as much a part of the society and the change that's going on as we are working in it. So I think what lawyers do changes generationally because of how lawyers were raised and what lawyers expected. So I think that's going to continue to happen. I think, I imagine that at any given point in time, what's considered traditional law is what the 60-year-old lawyers in the room did when they were 20. And I'm not sure that that's a particularly important data point to go off of. I think it's better to understand that the society is changing, the practice is changing, the technology is changing, and all those changes are happening faster. And the risk is the risk is not just to people who are sitting still. The risk is to people who aren't running fast enough to catch up with the changes.
Jimo, last word, and then we'll go to questions from the floor.
Yeah, I think I would agree with both of your comments. And how I see it changing, just based on the conversations that I've had with people all across the legal industry, is and people in technology as well, is there'll be less of an emphasis on the things that lawyers have been doing today, like data processing, a greater emphasis on the client, which I think is the art of being a lawyer, and doing things like advocacy, things that are extremely difficult for a computer to do. And I don't think any scientist in the world can currently draw a line to where we are today in terms of computers understanding to them being able to empathize with us. So I think we're going to see lawyers shifting more to the art of the law, and then I think we're going to see more lawyers like yourself, lawyers who are engineers, who are creating legal products for people at volume, at scale.
Well, thank you. How about we open it up for questions from anybody who has any? Fire away. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm really trying to figure out the state of the art for analytical reading, artificial intelligence or machine learning, machine reading, whatever you call it. Where is it at right now?
The question was the state of the art of artificial intelligence, machine learning? Analytical reading, okay.
So if you look at Canley and you do a search of privacy, there's I think 1,134 instances of privacy in the legislation last time I did the search a few years ago. And a startup was involved in 50 million users and that sort of thing, so they got an issue, right? So the lawyer said it's a rat's nest. He couldn't figure it out. So first of all, how do you figure that out? How do you figure out 1,134 instances of privacy in legislation right across Canada and regulations, that sort of thing? And then secondly, can machine reading, or I think it's called natural language generation, NLU, can it handle that? And I know you're cutting edge, or you know people that are. And what you told me today about regression analysis actually sounds like BlackBerry Jarvis, but applied in the legal industry. And you don't even have a measure of complexity for legal industry. I haven't heard one. But anyways, the basic question is, what is the state of the art of analytical reading, as opposed to simply highlighting, particular natural language understanding, which is not just the very word, but also synonyms of the word and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's been incredible progress recently when it comes to machine reading, computers being able to read documents and being able to identify the answer, and the answer may not have any of the words that were in the question and may be phrased completely differently. So in the news last week, you may have seen that Microsoft and Alibaba beat human-level performance on a test called the Squad data set. And what that was, it was Wikipedia, it was questions with Wikipedia articles, and a human had to answer the question given the article, and a computer had to as well. So machines were able to match and squeeze a few percentage points above human level performance. That's not to say that computers are better than humans at reading, because first off, if you look at the data set, those questions are extremely simple. But what is to be drawn from that is that the methods we have now to read documents compared to the methods we had even last year have improved dramatically. And in terms of what is the state of the art in machine reading of legal documents, I'll without a doubt say it's the work that we're doing at Ross Intelligence. That's where we put a lot of our emphasis and investment on. The first part of that was investing a lot in getting the data, getting a data set of question and answers so we could effectively evaluate the performance of our system compared to other systems and even their human counterparts. So that's what we've really been focused on today, and where I think we've been working with a lot of labs, a lot of scientists, and they're very excited about what we're doing because if you don't know a lot about machine learning, the most important machine learning is having the data to actually teach the machines. And that's what we've gone through the effort of doing in addition to engineering and designing machine learning algorithms.
Yeah, if I could pipe in there too. One of the, that programming language that you saw in my presentation, it's one of the potential uses of that kind of technology is to act as a middle language when we get the machine reading of legal texts to a much more advanced level than it's at now. You'll be aware of Google Translate and how it's able to, move text between languages. If we have those kinds of computing languages that formalize the ideas in legislation, we can have the computers translate from the actual legislation into a programming language like that. And that is a way that the computer can express its understanding of what the legislation says in a way that we can double check whether its understanding matches with our own without it having to come up with some other way of doing it. So those languages are kind of a human access to things that the machine learning is going to be able to do at some point in the future. I wouldn't wager a guess when.
So in other words, the lawyer was saying, this is a rat's nest right now. I can't figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond human ability to figure it out. And you're saying, theoretically, you're going to be able to solve that. You or people like you are going to be able to solve that.
So at some point in the future, it will be possible to have a machine read the legislation, generate an understanding of the elements in the legislation and how they relate to each other and what the logical requirements are for any particular legal outcome to be true, and then take a fact scenario and run it through that and answer a question for you, like a legal question, based on its own reading of the law. And those languages will act as a kind of a back end where a lawyer can double check what the computer's understanding is and correct it if it's wrong. Or so that's, I can see that at some point. It's a long ways off.
Actually, when it comes to the future, I'm not sure that I agree that's a long ways off. We tend as humans to look in the rearview mirror, take the last 20 years, flip it forward and say that's it. You're probably going to be more accurate if you take the last 250, flip it forward and call it 2035. 20 years for 250 years of what's already happened in the last 250. It's coming a lot faster than you think. I don't think Moore's law is a limit on AI, for example. It's learning, it's not doubling every 2 years. So it's going to happen quite a bit faster than you think. Another question from the floor, anybody? We got time for one more, I think. We at the back?
Cheers, thanks, Matt. This is, okay, there we go. This is a question for the panel, and I'm just wondering if they might kind of narrow their comments down from how the law is going to change to how the law might change for junior lawyers. Because a lot of what both you and the panel this morning have talked about, I see as kind of automating or or taking over the work that's traditionally delegated to law students, to juniors, research, those kinds of things. And also, I think there's a lot of talk as well about stuff that might, automate things in a way that might go direct to consumers and kind of go outside of lawyers. So I'm just wondering what the panel thinks where junior lawyers, people kind of fresh out or in their first couple of years, might wind up as technology develops.
All right, I'll try. So, you'll forgive me if I'm a little pie in the sky here, but to take both sides of it. The bad news is probably that traditional law firms are not going to know what exactly to do with you. And I think that's going to be more and more true. I think the news, and I'll let you characterize it as good or bad, however you like, is that the role of junior lawyers in larger firms is going to depend more on the ability of junior lawyers to demonstrate their own value, as opposed to fit into a system that used to be there. And the other thing that becomes possible, and this is, I'll preface this by saying I'm a bit of a revolutionary when it comes to these sorts of things, so take it with a grain of salt. But the way we have structured law firms right now with the pyramid, and it's modeled off of apprenticeship. And it's a teaching method that was designed in a world where the only way to learn the law was to read decisions that had been made. And there was always a lot to read. And it always took a long time to gather the information that way. Doing the work always took a long time, and so getting experienced at it always took a long time. So the only way to learn how to be a lawyer was to take a long time learning with other lawyers. At least some of us in this room are going to live in a world where you don't really read cases as your go-to in order to understand what the subject, the substantive law is. The tertiary resources at your disposal are going to get stronger and stronger. So you don't need years and years of experience reading the law in order to be able to answer legal questions quickly. The actual tasks that you're performing are going to be fast. And so you'll be able to get experience with them quickly. And so you don't need to work for multiple years under a more senior lawyer in order to become skilled at them. So you can look at it either as the law firms are not going to be sure what to do with you, or you don't need the law firms anymore.
We're out of time, so last word. I think it's going to be a lot more fun being a lawyer in the future, and it sounds to me like law schools are going to be disrupted as well. They're going to have to teach you different skills that you're not going to learn on the job anymore. So without anything further, that I think ends it. We're out of time, and I'd like to thank the panel very much for what I found to be an awesome discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for moderating. And as a current law student, I definitely look forward to that disruption you're talking about in the law schools. And I'll let you know when we start seeing significant impacts of that.